I couldn't carry on a conversation without coughing every 5 words, so I figured Sunday was not a good time to cough all over when everyone else sick. But it was a good time of spending time in the Word. Revelation is always a good place to go, and understanding the throne of God. But I bring you back to Mark, and before we begin this morning, just to let you know, if you put in your calendars, please, June 7th. June 7th, we have Dr. Stephen Van Horn is going to be back with us again. And there are other dynamics to his ministry going on with Item Ministry over in Africa. And so I've asked him to come and share with us. And I'm sure in light of all the other things that are going on now in Africa and all of the persecution with Christians and all of that, 2 pastors I heard announced just recently, have been arrested, taken into custody. So just keep praying for the believers there and for the church there. But June 7th, he will come and share with us again. And so look forward to that. Mark chapter 9, we'll start reading in verse 14 through verse 29. And when they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and some of the scribes arguing with them. And immediately when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed and began running to greet him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing with them?" And one of the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth, and he grinds his teeth, and he stiffens out. And I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it." And he answered them and said, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." They brought the boy to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling around and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. It has often thrown him both into fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the boy's father cried out and said, "I do believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that the crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again." And after crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out, and the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he got up. And when he came into the house, his disciples began questioning him privately, "Why could we not drive it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot come out by anything but prayer." I bring you to this next section in Mark's gospel. It's such a powerful section, but I just, before we begin, just to think upon these words that the song we just sang, "Oh, to see my name written in the wounds. For through your suffering I am free. Death is crushed, death, and life is mine to live, won through your selfless love. This the power of the cross. Son of God slain for us. What a love. What a cost. We stand forgiven at the cross." We are reminded as we come into this passage, I remind you that it is not only by the cross we enter into this relationship that we have with Jesus Christ and with God the Father, but it is the way of life when we enter into this relationship. The cross is not relegated to one point in time in our life. It's not relegated to merely to our conversion. It is to mark the entirety of our life. The reality of it is we are to live under the shadow of the cross every day of our life. And this is tough to do because when we come to this moment in Mark's gospel, we've moved from the Transfiguration now back down into the valley, and now the conflict is on, and now we're face to face with the enemy, and now we struggle, right? We've gotten a taste of the glory of the kingdom that is to come. We've got a taste of the metamorphosis that is going to take place. That which took place in Jesus Christ is also going to take place in us. There's going to be a transformation of our physical bodies being given spiritual ones, and we are to go through this great radical change, and we will be in the presence of the glory of God for all of eternity, but we still have to walk through the valley. And that is our lot for this life, and oftentimes we get frustrated. I told Les, every time I get sick, it takes a while for my body to process disease these days. Without a spleen and other things that have happened to my internal organs, my body doesn't fight so well as it used to. And so it takes a while for it to get rid of it. And I always think about sin whenever I'm sick. It just makes me think of the corrosiveness of it, the way that it permeates you, the way that you don't feel right? The way that it affects the way that you think, the way that you feel, all of these things. It hinders you, it hampers you, and it evades you from within. And it's those times that I wish that I could just be rid of this world. I share this with my kids, and I affirm to them I love them so much, and I love their mother dearly, but at the same time, I so desire to be out of this world. I'm tired of the sin sometimes. I'm tired of being down in that valley, are you not? I'm tired of seeing sin just now paraded all over society as though it's okay and it's embraced, not just by the world, but by the church. And you're saying to God, when is your holiness going to come and permeate this earth? When are we going to rid ourselves of all of unrighteousness? And when is righteousness going to reign in all of mankind? And when is every knee going to bow and confess that Jesus Christ is Lord? I so want that day to come, but until then, we struggle and we fight and we contend with the enemy. And this is such a powerful passage because we're dealing with a frail faith. And many of us understand this. There's important lessons in this passage for us to understand. And so I bring you here this morning, but we make this transition from the Transfiguration, this great moment when the disciples see the promised glory that is going to come in regards to the kingdom and the Son. And we have this so well pictured here and captured, moving from this Transfiguration down into the valley where we come across this father and the demon-possessed son. The disciples are not allowed to linger there for long because it's time for them to get back down into the skirmishes of war. But it's interesting as I thought about this passage, I thought about certain elements in the Old Testament. I think about the moment in Moses' life, right, when he goes up on the mount. He gets a purview. He gets to spend time with God. He fellowships with God in a way that no one else did. He had such an intimate fellowship with God and was being able to see somewhat of the glory of God that when he came down from the mount, his face was shining. But he spent this time on Mount Sinai. And in Exodus 24:16 it says this, the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the seventh day he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud. Not only that, but Elijah up on the mount in 1 Kings 19. Then he came there to a cave and he lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. Both of them had this moment of respite, this moment, a taste of something that no one else got to taste. Christ and the three disciples were given a moment of tasting something that no one else was allowed to taste, and they weren't even allowed to divulge it until much later. But eventually they have to come down from the mount. Eventually Moses had to come down, and he confronted the rebellion and the idolatry that was carrying on amongst the people with Aaron. Eventually Elijah had to come down, and he had to fight against the paganism of Jezebel and Ahab. Eventually, Jesus Christ, we find him after the dedication in Mark chapter 1 at the baptism. He is driven, it said, he is driven out into the wilderness to face the enemy being tempted by him. Not only that, but we have Jesus up on the mount, a transfiguration with the three, Peter, James, and John. And as he comes down the mount, he's immediately confronted by a dispute. He's confronted by the inability of the disciples. He's confronted by a father who is struggling, not only for his son who's demon-possessed, but also in his experience of faith. He is lacking. He is frail. Oftentimes God gives us those moments, right, where we get a purview of what it all looks like in the grand scheme of things, but we remember that we have to come down into the valley because this is where we belong and this is where we are to carry out the ministry. And so I bring you this passage this morning, the cure of the demon-possessed boy. verses 14 through 19. And it stands in such contrast to the Transfiguration. We have desperate human need reflected here. We have the failure of the disciples. We have the failure on the Father's part in regards to his faith. We realize that as wonderful as the mount was and as wonderful as the experience was and how amazing it was, and Peter wanted to build the tabernacles, he didn't want to come down. He wanted to stay there. He didn't want to face the suffering of the Messiah and all of these things. Yet at the same time, the disciples' primary occupation is in the valley of service. And that is where we are. And that is where we are to be until God consummates his plan. And we realize then that down in this valley, we're going to have our struggles and we're going to have our weaknesses. And we have to be like the Father, willing to acknowledge those. It's such a great openness that he acknowledges his faith in Christ. At the same time, he is conscious of the weakness and the need to grow and to be strengthened in that. But see, only insofar as we can do that, only then that can we really truly grow, because we need to understand our deficiencies before we can understand that we need to grow and to develop. But the great thing about this particular episode is it shows the reality of living in the world in the absence of Jesus. Disciples got a great foretaste of what is to come, but they needed to understand what it was going to be like when he's not around anymore. And the great thing is that in John's gospel, Jesus Christ prayed on the behalf of them, and he promised the Holy Spirit was going to come, that another comforter would come, that another we would be with you, and he would guide you, and he would be there just as Christ was there, encouraging and exhorting you and bringing that comfort and ease that you need in the midst of trial and struggles and so on. So he doesn't leave us alone, but at the same time, he helps us understand that there is going to be warfare, and we have to engage in it. And again, Jesus Christ, when he calls the confession from the lips of the disciples, Peter being the representative, he does it on the way. And I remind you that discipleship is not something that's done on the sidelines. It's out there in the fray. It's out there in the warfare. We must fight the battle. We cannot stay in our ivory towers. We cannot hide ourselves in our cubicles. We must get out there in the world and contend with the enemy, because that is what God's design is for us. But it's not only instructive for the disciples, it's instructive for us, because we know that he is gone, but he will return. But what is our lot? And how do we deal with the issues in life and the frustrations that happen? How do we work down here in the valley? How can we be sure that we can have victory in the face of such a great opposition? Because when we look at the impact of Satan on this young man, it's a physical representation of what Satan does spiritually in the lives of people. This is something that he relishes. This is something that satisfies him. This is something that triumphs for him. This is something that he takes joy in, bringing on the kind of affliction that we find reflected in this young man. And he does it in life after life after life after life. How do we contend with that? How do we fight against such a fierce enemy? How do we stand strong in the face of that? So I bring you to verses 14 and 15. We have the descent in the midst of dispute. And it's interesting because notice with me, verse 14, when they came back, to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and some of the scribes were arguing with them. You'll notice in the NASB we have some in italics, and the reason for this is because there is no article, there is no definite article here, the scribes, it's an arthrus. And so therefore it's indicating that there are several scribes. This wasn't a delegation from Jerusalem like we've seen before. These are scribes likely that lived in the area. They were following Jesus. They were always keeping a watchful eye on him. They were always watching what he did, listening to what he taught. But they obviously were there taking opportunity to bring shame, to taunt the disciples for their inability to do this, to cast out this evil spirit, and obviously trying to discredit Jesus. And we're not told of the whole discussion, but we can sort of piece together what they're arguing about in light of the episode that is laid out for us in regards to this demon-possessed son and the failure of the disciples to be able to handle it. And we notice verse 15 immediately, Euthus. We find this again in Mark's gospel 3 times in this particular passage. We find it over and over as gospel that Mark utilizes this in different ways. One, to move the narrative along, but each instance has its own significance. But immediately upon seeing Jesus, the crowd was alarmed at his presence. Now, it's interesting because someone suggested, well, it's probably because he came from the Mount of Transfiguration and he is emanating some of the glory like Moses, right? When he had that face-to-face with God, that his face glowed. And so therefore, there was some of this residue of the glory of Christ from Transfiguration. And this is why the people were alarmed. No, because if you look in the context, chapter 9, verse 9, and as they were coming down from the mount, he gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. If Jesus wanted to keep this concealed, then there is no way that then he is going to walk down, still manifesting some of the glory from the mount. The reason for the surprise is the unexpected presence of Jesus Christ. Here, they're in the midst of this argument. All of a sudden, he comes out of nowhere with the other three disciples. They're not expecting it. All of a sudden, then they turn with great alarm. They come rushing to him because of the midst of what is going on, this argument between the religious leaders and the disciples, and the crowd comes to him. And Jesus is going to request from them, verse 16, and he said to them, "What are you discussing with them?" This is going to introduce a dialogue that Jesus is going to have with this Father, because the disciples aren't going to answer, the crowd's not going to answer, the religious leaders aren't going to answer. It's going to be this Father who comes from the midst of this crowd, the one who is truly desperate because of the condition of his Son. And Jesus is going to question them to find out what is happening. The Father then comes from their midst, verse 16. Notice with me. And he was asking what you were discussing with them. Verse 17, one of the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth, and he grinds his teeth, and he stiffens out. And I told your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do it." In these verses, we find Jesus is going to respond to this distraught father as he enters into this conversation with him. And it's very fascinating, the interaction that goes on. First, the father begins with this address, "Teacher." Obviously, he understood that there was something unique about Jesus, but he still uses a common designation. He doesn't refer to them as the Christ, the Messiah, or anything like that. He doesn't even refer to him as a prophet. He referred to him as teacher. But obviously, he understood he had some sort of power by which he could have delivered his son from this situation. But upon arriving on the scene, not finding Jesus, he then petitions his disciples, because more than likely he has heard that the disciples could also cast out evil spirits, which they've already done back in chapter 6. And so therefore he petitions them, since Christ is not there, and asks for them to do this, and they are not able to do this. But we find this designation of respect, at least, as he addresses Jesus. And then the Father is going to give the description of the Son. And this is such a horrible description. It's sort of hard for us sometimes with things like this to put ourselves in the shoes of the Father, because we don't necessarily see demon possession as they saw it back then. In the life of Christ, there was such an onslaught of attack from Satan. And we find more, anywhere in Scripture, we find more demon possession taking place in the life of Christ than any other time that we find in the Scriptures, Old or New Testament. Why? Because this was a full-on assault by Satan, trying to hinder or thwart the plan of God. But I just tell you, try to put yourself in the place of this Father and understand the state of desperation. His son is under the control of something that his son cannot control, the Father cannot rid him of, and it is something that is destructive. I mean, you've got to imagine that as the Father describes in verse 18, as he describes him foaming at the mouth after being thrown to the ground because of these violent convulsions that come, he grinds his teeth, he stiffens out, literally as he withers. In other words, it's reflecting the weariness and the dehydration that would come on. And if I could put it in pedestrian terminology, this demon was sucking the life out of the Son. Not only that, but casting him into fire, casting him into water. You've got to imagine that this young man had scars all over his body from multiple times of being thrown into the fire. The affliction that this spirit was weighing upon the son of this father, and this father unable to deliver his own child from this. Understand the desperation. And I think for many of us, and I know for my parents, there was a time where they sensed a period of desperation in my own life. But look at the description. The demon drives him to the point that he has no power to speak or even hear, verse 25 of chapter 9. The demon often convulses him with violent seizures. The term here uses in reference to tearing apart. The violence that the demon threw this young man to the ground was like ripping this human body to shreds as he convulsed on the ground, foaming at the band, grinding his teeth. The demon tried to destroy the boy, casting him into water, into fire. This was an abiding condition as Jesus asked the Father, how long has this been happening? Verse 21, he uses the perfect tense here. This has been an abiding condition. The Father says it's been happening from childhood. In other words, a greater portion of his life he's been going through this. And the Father's at his wit's end. The desperation that he feels because of the condition of his son, he cannot free him. The disciples cannot free him. And here he now pleads his case to Jesus Christ. Can you free him? Can you help us? But understand the influence and the power of Satan and the destructiveness of it. This is such a great picture of what Satan tries to do and his motivation. It is destructive, and we find in a very physical way what he tries to do in a spiritual way. And we've talked about this before back in Mark 5 and dealing with the demoniacs, the Gerasenes, that the work of Satan is trying to destroy the image of God and man, the imago Dei, and this is part of the process that he goes through. It is this distortion and trying to destroy it. But you understand that this kind of destruction goes on a regular basis with Satan. It hasn't ended with the life of Christ. It still goes on today, but it's with the mental and the moral aspect of man's life that he is disfigured. We see in a physical sense what Satan continues today, even now, in the spiritual sense in the lives of individuals. This is his attempt. He wants to destroy the image of God in man. The disciples come from this great glorious mount of seeing the glory of Christ. They come down into the midst of dispute and face to face with the enemy, and the severity of it and the destructiveness of it. I mean, this is what brings delight and satisfaction to Satan, when he can obscenely twist and distort individual lives. And he still does it today. He still does it today. It's interesting because, I had this discussion with Les. We were talking about, we just met someone through soccer, one of the parents, and she's a believer and very outspoken. And it was interesting because Les had a conversation with her not too long ago, and she came home. She said it was fascinating because, she talks about the attacks of Satan and so on, and so-and-so's life and this and that. And it's interesting because, there are things I've noticed in the church that we just don't talk about much anymore. We don't talk about faith a whole lot because we're so influenced by the world and the need for empirical evidence. We don't even talk about faith anymore. It's interesting that we have become so naturalistic that it's really rare to hear believers talk about the soul and the spirit. The spiritual constitution of man. It's interesting also that, especially in the evangelical realm, especially when we're moving away from Pentecostals and the charismatics, and we don't even talk about the Holy Spirit, who's such a vital role in our life as believers, and he's still operating, even though you may think certain things have ceased, which I believe does not mean he has stopped working in the church and in our lives and directing and guiding. We don't even talk about him anymore. And we don't talk about Satan. We do not talk about his attacks. We do not talk about the conflict. We are so influenced by the world that we just don't even see this happening in our own lives. And then when we have conversations with people that do, right, it sort of stands out as that's really weird, right? Because I'm not used to hearing this. And it's refreshing when you come across people like that, right? When we're using these terminologies, right? And understanding where the real warfare is. Satan has not stopped. Read 1 Timothy, turn with me, 1 Timothy chapter 4. Just covering this on Wednesday night class. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, but the Spirit explicitly says that in later times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. This is a subjective genitive in the Greek text. In other words, these are doctrines that are produced by the demons. It is happening now. We look at these false teachers on TV and everything else, but we fail to understand that there is an operator behind these men. Verse 2, we understand that it comes through human means, by means of the hypocrisy of liars seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron. But these demonic forces are active in their lives and utilizing them to convey these false doctrines, leading people astray. And it's happening now. Ephesians chapter 4. Dealing with the issue of relationships in the church. Jesus gives this warning, or Paul gives this warning in chapter 4, verse 26, be angry, yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity, a foothold, literally a place. He is still looking for places in our lives. And see, if he can get into our life, and he can get into the body life, then he can rain destruction. And we yield these footholds on a regular basis. So my father, when he was preaching through Ephesians, and he got all the way through the book, got to chapter 6, and all of a sudden the spiritual warfare, and all of a sudden light started going on. It says, I turned around and I preached right through Ephesians one more time because I finally got it. We are in a warfare against an enemy who likes to destroy as much as he possibly can, not just physically maiming, spiritually maiming, morally maiming. We see his effects upon society around us, but we also give him footholds into the church and into our lives, and we must be on guard. And in the ferociousness of this enemy, there's only one way that we can fight him off and to confront him, and that is through the issue of faith and being dependent on the power of God. And we find that in the midst of this dialogue that Jesus has with the Father and these disciples. I take you back to Mark chapter 9. The Father's appeal to disciples, it was a legitimate one, verse 18. It was legitimate for him to come and ask them. They'd been able to cast out demons before, but then he reveals to Christ, but they could not do it. The disciples had proved to be impotent in the face of such an opposition. They were unable to face a world and minister to a broken world, someone who was in state of desperation. And the reason for this isn't that they didn't try. The reason for this, is we're going to find, is because of their disbelief. And this is Jesus' response in verses 19 and following after hearing this from the Father in his statement. Jesus says, verse 19, he answers and said to him, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me. This is Jesus' response in regards to this situation, as he realizes the reason for this. And it's such a deep and emotional response. And it's interesting because the terminology that's used here is very unusual. This declaration of "oh" that we have here before the statement of the unbelieving, this is not used in direct address typically. This was an emotional response by Jesus in regards to the situation. We have to understand the humanity of Christ in this. And this is the thing that I was talking about before. We understand that Christ is fully God and fully man. 100% God, 100% man. And we have no trouble making that theological affirmation. But here's the problem. When we come to the Gospels, we read the epistles into the Gospels. And so when we look at Christ in the Gospels, we see 100% God and 50% man. He is 100% man. These responses that we find from him, the crying out, the exasperation of the Spirit and so on, in chapter 8 when the religious leaders asked for one more sign after seeing so many, give us one more from heaven so we can be sure. And he sighs deep within his spirit. This is his human nature. This is his human spirit. As he is responding to these situations, this is Jesus Christ in his humanity responding to the sinfulness that surrounds him. O unbelieving generation. And he is going to sigh at the very thing, the very cause of all spiritual failure, and that is the lack of faith in God. See, this is the one thing as we contend down in the valley against the enemy. We need faith. Faith. This is why the whole gospel starts off with Jesus preaching, repent and believe. And they're both present tenses, continuously be repenting. We need to continuously be reorienting our mind to the right way of things, to God's way of things. And we need to continuously be living in faith, constantly be trusting in God. Because there's no way that we can contend with the enemy if we do not trust God. Because there's no way that we can do it in our own power. And even the spiritual giftedness that we're given, like the disciples, they were given a gift to be able to cast out these evil spirits, but yet they still needed to walk in dependence and trust in God, even with that gift, and so do we. Sometimes we experience the manifestation, the gift that Christ has given to us, and we see it manifested. And in the early days when we started to do ministry and to use this gift, we walked in dependence on God. But after we did it for a while, we say, hey, I can do that. I have the gift. And then all of a sudden we stop leaning on God. And then we wonder why I keep falling and I keep stumbling and I keep failing over and over in these areas. Why? Because I don't depend on Him. You can't ever let go of the source. You just can't. The enemy is way too strong. You can never walk alone, but yet we try to do it so often in our lives. Right? And we may not utter the words, but in our hearts we say it to God, I got this. I got this, God. And He's saying, no, you don't. No, you don't. Because you don't understand how ferocious this enemy is, and how powerful he is, and how destructive he is. And Jesus so exasperated. And yes, He is including the disciples in the statement. It's obvious from verse 18. It is what brings about this emotional response. He's not just talking about the crowd, nor is He just talking about the religious leaders. When He talks about this unbelieving generation, He is talking about the spiritual dullness of His own disciples and their failure to be able to do because they didn't grasp the fact that they need to walk in dependence on God. Not only that, but He follows it up with these rhetorical questions that shows the deeper grief that is going on in His own heart at the spiritual dullness of His disciples, the weariness, the disappointment. I mean, read the statements in verse 19. How long, right? How long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? And literally it is this twice. Until when shall I put up with you? Until when shall I endure this? When is the end going to come for me? When is my mission going to be complete? We're not comfortable with this kind of Jesus. I just tell you, we're not, right? But this is legit. And if He is sinless humanity, and He was, yes, we all believe that, otherwise there's no salvation. If He was sinless humanity, then there was nothing sinful about this response. It was completely justified. And sometimes I wonder, I don't hear it audibly from God, but I have to imagine. I wonder how many times God says it about me. Oh, you unbelieving son. How long do I have to put up with you? The term that he uses here, put up an echo, it's used in Ephesians chapter 4. Mark reflects this great burden in the words of Christ that Jesus was bearing up under. This was a heavy load for Him. Not only did He face the opposition of the people around Him, the rejection of His own people, the rejection of the religious leaders, even His own family thought He was nuts. And now, over and over, He has to deal with the spiritual dullness of His disciples. But you know what's so amazing about this, though, is the complexity of Christ, which we will see in His response to the Father in this young man. But you know, the issue with the disciples, there's some important lessons to learn. It wasn't as though they didn't try. They tried. Contextually, we see this. They tried, but they failed. And we also see something that's very interesting, because obviously when they tried, they expected something. So faith isn't just merely a sense of expecting something to happen. There's something more to faith. See, it's not enough even in our own life to just expect things to happen. There's more to faith than that. They tried. Their problem wasn't for want of trying. It wasn't for the want of expecting something to happen. It was for a want of disbelief. They had no faith. They had no faith. I ask myself, do I really trust God? I say I believe, but do I walk in that constant state of trustfulness? Dan Chumley, I watch him. I so enjoy this brother. I can't think of time I've not seen a smile on his face. And this is not an easy time for him. And I understand, as a husband and a father wanting to provide for his family, I understand the difficulty he's going through. I understand the difficulty too, because he sees what God's role is for his life, and he so desires to be in that role on a regular basis, but he knows he has hoops to go through. But to walk in the trust, right, of God, and know that when you have the bills spread on the table before you, and you know you don't have a dime, and you have nothing that you could sell that would ever pay for any of these things, and you sit there and you look at this, right, and you know the enemy's got to be screaming just ideas of doubt in your face, saying, no, 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 but then to put it out there and just to trust, trust, trust. And know that when your circumstances are saying this is absolutely impossible for it to happen, you say, I believe in a God of impossible. This is the problem with the disciples, you see. They didn't believe. They didn't trust in the God of the impossible. They believed in the process. They've seen it happen. They've believed in the experience. They've seen it in their own life and ministry. In chapter 6, they came back in verse 30 and recounted to Christ the things that they said and the things that they did. They cast out demons. But the problem is that they did not have an abiding rest of faith in God. I remember listening to Alistair Begg one time preaching, and he was sharing it at Spurgeon Fellowship. He was talking about the fact the first time he was asked to preach in church. I believe he comes from an Anglican background. And one of his mentors was there in the congregation, his first sermon he was preaching, and he said, I struggled. I was wrestling with the message, where do I preach from, and the outline, all this stuff. He says, I borrowed this message from a well-known pastor, outlined and everything. And he says, I knew when I was up there preaching that my mentor was looking me dead in the eye, and he knew, and I knew he knew, that this was not my message. And he says, from that point on, he says, I would, when I prepare for a message every Sunday, he goes, I would just throw my notes down on the floor, and I would prostrate myself on the floor, and I would beg from God understanding into His Word. And he says, and I don't have to go back 30-some years to draw upon this as something in my life. I can go back to this last week. What he was affirming was that every single week there was this necessity. Even though he's preached umpteen sermons, he still has to walk in dependence on God. And it was good for me to understand that and to be reminded of that fact, because see, you do ministry and you use the gift and you see God working through you, and then you walk on and say, oh, I've done this before, I don't need God. Yes, you do. No matter how seasoned you are, no matter how much you've been around, you still need to walk in dependence on God. We're a creature. That's our existence. It's dependence. I mean, it's funny to me how in our mindset, we think we're raising our kids to be independent. It's such a skewed way of looking at life. It's not a biblical way of looking at life. I am raising my children to be interdependent on the body and to be dependent on God. That's the spiritual reality of it. And the disciples need to understand, you just never leave that faith behind. You must walk in that. But notice, even in the midst of this, the response of Christ and the unbelief and the exasperation, the weariness of it, there's still compassion in his response. Notice verse 21. And he asked the Father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. It has often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Even Jesus being frustrated and wearied by the disbelief that surrounded him, he was still compassionate. Isn't that awesome? This is a great example and lesson for us in discipling people. There may be times where you're just going, are you going to get it? Are you going to get it? Are you going to get it? But that doesn't mean we put aside all compassion and everything else. We're complex beings. We can do both. And Jesus in his humanity, he was both tired and wearisome from the load of unbelief that surrounded him, but at the same time he was still compassionate, and he gave the Father a chance to unburden himself. Just think about this. Jesus is already low down enough as it is. not just physically, but spiritually. The weight that he is under by this point in his life and ministry, and the fact that he is moving towards the cross, and he knows that it's looming, he's in the shadow of it, and all this stuff that is going on, and he is still willing to allow the Father to unload his burden on him, and to be so compassionate to hear him out. That's ministry. That's ministry. This is parenting. I watch my wife, right? You're exhausted by the weariness of the day and the schedule and everything else. And then you have kids who are in need and they come and they just want to draw from you some more. Yes? That's ministry. It's life. It's the life of the believer. And guess what? It doesn't end until you go home to be with the Lord. It just doesn't. It comes in different shapes and forms. We think when the kids are gone, it's all over. No, it's not done. All right? Ask the grandparents. It's not done. It's never done. Ministry's never done. Jesus is willing to allow the Father to unload himself, but Jesus is also going to draw the Father out because he wants to get to the heart of the issue and he wants to address the Father's doubt. And I love this because the Father, he's not just looking for the deliverance of his Son. When he petitions Christ and he asks him, please, help us. Can you do anything? Verse 22. Help us. This deliverance wasn't just for the Son, it was for the Father too. All the agony that the Father goes through as he watches his Son flail about on the ground, grinding his teeth, the destructiveness of what's happening to him. The Father can't do anything about it. He is emotionally caught up in all of this, right? And he says, if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And Jesus is going to pick up on his words and get to the heart of the problem. If I can, that's not the issue. You see, that's the reality of it, right? It's not if he can, it's do we believe. You see, this is not a Jesus thing. It's not a God thing. It's a you thing. It's a me thing. Over and over, Christ affirms that God is the God of the impossible. Chapter 10, he's going to remind us of it again. He can do anything. The issue is not whether I can or can't. The issue is, do you believe it or not? And Jesus says the real issue is simply this. It's not my ability to heal the boy, but it's the Father's inability to trust God who can do what is humanly impossible. You see, no man's going to spread the bills upon the table and pray over them to a God who cannot do. And the amazing thing is, Dan recounted to me this moment in his life this last week, as he shared with me Wednesday night. He says 2 days later a check came and it paid all the bills exactly. Would it be that we just all lived our life with our resources completely exhausted? Just don't even look to them, right? This is the thing I'm in awe of my father about, and I just don't know how. I think I'm getting there, but I'm not quite where he's at. My father lives life differently than most, and he tends to rub people the wrong way because of the way he lives his life. Some people think he has a lot, and I'll just tell you, he does not have a lot. Some might think the way that he lives his life is that he's got a full bank account. I'll just tell you, he does not have a full bank account. But here's how he lives and has always lived. He lives as though his God owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. And he has lived that for as long as I can remember. It's a crazy way to live your life. It really is. But it's an amazing way to live your life as you see this God who is the God of the impossible over and over showing you what he can do. And I never doubt that God can't do. It's just amazing the way that he does it, you know. But so often when we face things in life, we just forget that this God can do anything. He is infinite. He is transcendent. He can't even be contained by this universe. He is that massive. I mean, you can't even really use the word big. You can't even use that he's a mega God because those terms don't even apply to him because he can't even abide by those designations. He's so massive. Infinite doesn't even cover it. Boundless doesn't even cover it. These are our just failed human attempts to try to give Scripture to a God we can't describe. And if He is that enormous in existence and that enormous in capability and that glorious, why do we ever doubt? Why do we ever doubt? Jesus, verse 23, He's going to pull it out of the Father. All things are possible to him who believes. He's going to contrast the power of faith over against the Father's doubt, and He's going to elicit from Him a response of faith. And the Father responds, and He responds, I believe, but help my unbelief, verse 24. Listen to me, if I can define faith by this context, faith sets no limits on God's power, but it submits itself to God's will in making its petitions. I know God can do anything, right? He can remove us from this situation. He can take this out of our life. He can do all of these things. The question is He willing to do so? And if He doesn't, why? But we need to know He's able. He's able. The Father cries out in such deep emotion, openly confessing His faith, yet consciously acknowledging the weakness. This is the role of every disciple. If anyone is a true follower of Christ, we're going to utter these words all the time. If I can give you this thought, faith which declares itself openly, yet at the same time recognizes its weakness and pleads for help, is a growing faith. In one sense, we should be uttering the very words of the Father all the time. I believe, but help my unbelief. Yes? I want it to be strengthened. I want it to grow. And Jesus draws this out of him, and not only that, but He's going to address the issue of the disciples. And I love this because, Jesus could just let these things go. I think back to the woman who touched the fringe of His garment. He could have let the encounter go, but He didn't. He made it a very personal thing. He does this with His Father, doesn't let it go. He draws him out. He affirms him in his faith, and then He helps him to understand that he needs to grow in that. And the disciples, He pulls them aside, verses 28 and 29. And when He came into the house, and notice here in the NSB, the word "does" in italics, it's not in the original, a house. We don't know which one, whose house, but it was a place for privacy. And His disciples began questioning Him privately, why could we not drive it out? And He said to them, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. I believe that likely Jesus is addressing the fact that when dealing with the spiritual forces, there are those of differing degrees and differing power. And this was of such a kind that they needed to pray before they could ever do. But it was a reminder to them that they needed to walk in an abiding faith and trust in the power of God, the God of the impossible. This was a lesson in faith, not only for the Father, but also for the disciples. How do we face such an enemy down in this valley of service that we are to be in until the glorious return of our Lord and Savior? How do we deal with it? And it's simply this, by faith. By faith. It's why it's amazing. When you look at Matthew's gospel and he gives these accounts and he talks about the power of the Messiah, and then you have the sending out of the disciples and then power, and then sending out the disciples and then power. There is this reminder to them that the only way you can go out and do ministry in the world and face the enemy and do what I called you to do in this valley of service is to do so in my power and my power alone. We need to go out and try, yes. We need to expect, but faith is more than just expecting something to happen. It's walking in complete trust and dependence on God and yielding to His will. May God help us as we contend with this enemy, because he is ferocious. And although we don't see his work physically as much as we see it spiritually, he is out there and operating, and he will do so until Christ puts him away finally and forever. We must contend with him, but the only way we can do that is to completely lean on God. May God help us as we seek to serve in this valley. Let's pray. Our gracious